gives me great pleasure to introduce you now to Simon Cooper, the CEO of Corporate Commercial Institutional Banking and CEO of Europe and the Americas of Standard Chartered, and Jacqueline Poh. We're also joined by, she is the Managing Director for the Singapore Economic Development Board. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much. I hope you're having a good Davos so far. So Simon, to you first, let's remind ourselves of the amount that's needed. It's $94.8 trillion if emerging markets have to have a just transition to reach net zero by 2060. So why does public-private partnerships play a vital role rather than just relying solely on government money?
So, well, firstly, I mean, you sort of let 94.8 trillion slip off your tongue
I know.
It doesn't really matter. That's quite a lot.
Put it into context, the size of the money, the amount we're talking about.
So what I was going to do was say, to link into your question, another big number is $2 trillion, which is the amount that households would suffer if that expenditure was funded by taxation alone.
Wow.
So you can see that there's an economic need to bring in private sector finance to fund many, many trillions of dollars, numbers that most people can't comprehend. So I think when we talk about just transition, we're talking about, and you just had on your panel now, the need for economies to move to net zero, but at the same time not shrink. The economies need to also grow and thrive. So that balance of funding is hugely important, I think.
So tell me about the role then of public-private partnerships. Where do you see them fitting in?
So I think there's the role between, we know there's a huge amount of capital.
Yeah.
We know there are a huge amount of projects.
Yeah.
Merging those two, bringing that capital, crowding it into the opportunity, I think is where public-private comes together. So it's by making those projects bankable, by making them investable, by making the taxonomies consistent. That, to me, is the essence of public-private partnership.
And it's not just about finance, is it, Jacqueline, as well? When we talk about public-private financing, of course, there's a lot of money involved. But why is that combination so vital when we're looking at mitigating climate change?
Thanks a lot. Even if you were able to finance every project that made sense for climate action, that wouldn't alone provide the context of products that could be put out in markets, that could get commercialized easily with decent government regulation that supported all of that. So actually, partnerships go way beyond finance, although finance is a huge component of what is needed in terms of partnerships for climate action. There's also a lot more that can be done to pull together the entire value chain to get through the research that can create the products, the entrepreneurs that can build the businesses, and the governments that can provide the kind of enabling environment that can facilitate the growth of these solutions and the scaling of these solutions in countries worldwide. And that's what we consider very important for business for good, which is something that we push in Singapore because we think that business has a huge role to play in providing a lot of these solutions in partnership with the public sector to be able to have these projects out there and mitigate climate change.
Simon, help me out, because we're talking about big numbers, aren't we now? The world's top 300 investment firms, how much under management? Is it 50 trillion or is it more? I forget, but it's...
I think it's more, but it's a huge amount.
It's a huge number. And I know that your job and Standard Chartered's job is to try and get that money flow from the north to the south, because a lot of it's held in the north, isn't it? So you've got these great opportunities. There's a great demand, isn't there? How do you get more of the investment to flow?
So I think rather to Jacqueline's point, I mean, governments play a role as well.
Which we've heard a lot so far.
There's a real role for setting a framework, for being consistent, for transparency. And I think you'll have heard the word transparency a lot during the course of today. And I think our role as financiers is to leverage that and to really be the conduit for that capital coming in. And there's a huge prize if we get it right. So if you think about India, so a solar power plant in India has about 7 times the impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions as that same plant would have in a Western European country.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
So if we can get that capital to flow in, there's a real opportunity in terms of that acceleration of net zero.
And Jacqueline, I'm sure you've got some fantastic examples for us as well in terms of the speed and also the scale and the innovation that you see when you get public-private partnerships right? What could you tell us?
That's absolutely right. So in Singapore, we've worked to actually combine the public and the private sector together in 3 ways. One is the idea that you need joint investment, the public sector and the private sector, in order to get the solutions and in order to do the research that gets the kind of solutions that create a green revolution. So the Singapore government has put aside more than $100 million in a fund to provide research into low carbon energy solutions. And clearly that's also working together with companies like Shell and Exxon and Sabana Jurong to be able to create low carbon solutions, CCUS and hydrogen and so on, including the test beds for that. Then after you've done the joint investment, public and private, into creating those research solutions, there is also the matter of lead demand. A lot of green projects fail because they can't be scaled up in time.
Yeah.
And so government can play a very critical role in providing lead demand to ensure that viable projects are scalable. One great example happened in 2014. Now in Singapore, a lot of our housing stock, about 80%, is under public housing control by something called the Housing Development Board. The Housing Development Board was very far-sighted in wanting to stimulate the growth of the solar power market in Singapore. So they put forth these tenders that would put solar power and solar panels on the roofs of all the housing stock of the HDB apartments. And that provided the kind of scale and lead demand that companies were able to tap on to say that this works, and this works at scale. Again, that happened when the public sector Public Utilities Board, which runs water and reservoirs in Singapore, decided to put out tenders to have floating solar farms on our reservoirs, which is not something that is done in many countries, but was a great way of showing that a viable technology could be actually implemented in a government setting. And that really created a great testbed and a platform for companies like Sunseap in Singapore to grow.
Yeah.
I suppose the last bit that I think governments can work with the private sector is to help them commercialize those solutions. And here we've also worked with companies like Dole to create great go-to-market strategies and user testing for products that they wouldn't have otherwise considered as part of the circular economy. For example, parts of the pineapples that aren't used for pineapple, the leaves and the stems, can actually be turned into enzymes, powders, extracts, and oils for pharmaceuticals and cosmetics. And the government, through EDB, New Ventures, had worked with companies like Dole to make that market possible.
Simon, how important is it to take a market-by-market approach? And how important is it to have knowledge on the ground? Because it's very complex, isn't it? Well, it certainly sounds it to me.
I mean, if everybody had an EDB in their market, it would make life a lot easier,
yeah,
it has to be said. But they don't.
Yeah.
So I think if you're a company or an investor today, you do have to look market by market. You have to understand, the landscape you're operating in. You have to look at the opportunities that exist.
And are investors doing that?
Investors are having to do that.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways forward is actually to start to remove that need for quite such a market-by-market approach.
Right.
So as you've talked about standardization and transparency, I think the more investors can start to feel comfortable across the board, the more you'll see that catalyzation of investment dollars. So at the moment, it can at times be too much like hard work.
Yes.
Because you haven't got the EDB or EDB equivalent everywhere.
Because if you look at the list of parties, I've written them down here actually, Jacqueline, you've got, obviously you've got industry, you've got policymakers, regulators, non-governmental organisations, and also the most important people, that's the local communities. They're people we mustn't forget about at all.
And scientists and ultimately
engineers.
workforce engineers.
I'm sure the list. I'm sure I've missed someone off. Hang on, let me write that down. But anyway, I'm sure the list carries on. But what needs? I mean, again, there's probably not one size fits all. But what needs to be in place to make sure that you talked about projects that get off the ground and some that haven't. So what are the characteristics of the successful ones?
I think one of the first things that you need for a successful project is to establish a really clear and audacious goal that everyone can sort of get behind and get alignment on. The more that different parts of the ecosystem, that includes your policymakers, your regulators, as well as the companies and the communities and the consumers, can actually understand what you're trying to achieve, I think that's more than 50% of the solution. In many ways, that's why net zero is so critical. And that's why countries like Singapore have established, what we think should be our net zero targets and how we're going to get there. After you've created your goal, you've got to find a way of incentivizing everyone to follow that path. And again, that's where carbon pricing is going to be so important as part of that solution, because it establishes what needs to be done for something to be bankable, something to be profitable, and so on. And these are some of the great parameters that you can have to have a successful project.
You're nodding in agreement there, Simon?
Yeah, I think ultimately, this comes back to the public-private partnership that you talked about at the beginning. There has to be economic viability.
Yeah.
You can transition that in terms of different support levels on the way, but ultimately there has to be economic gain to crowd in the investment dollars that are needed, and that's exactly what Jacqueline's alluding to, I think.
So, what returns could investors make, or is that a very difficult question to answer? I mean, you said that there's a huge potential out there, isn't there?
So, if you look at last year, last year was a record in terms of the amount of sustainable debt issued. I think there's about $1.6 trillion of sustainable debt issued. So you know that investors are making sufficient returns to be attracted by that. When you break that down, the vast majority of that debt was in green. So I think what needs to happen is that the sort of appetite and the returns need to spread throughout the broader ESGs. We need to think about infrastructure, we need to think about education, we need to think about data networks. I think that's the next stage. So there is clearly a return that's attractive. We just need to make that return attractive more across the board.
And your targets for next year, or predictions? If you had 1.6 trillion, was it last year, you said?
I'm always wrong. Pleasingly, I'm always wrong on the downside. So,
oh, good.
So I'm a banker. You've got to be a slight pessimist. So no, look, I think we'll continue to. There's a huge wall of capital looking for a home as a result of the fiscal expansion of the last few years, and there's a huge demand for sustainability as a criteria for that investment. So I think that will continue to grow, provided we can help in terms of the frameworks to enable investors to realise their ambition. Yeah. It's not a lack of funding.
Okay, we'll talk about frameworks in a bit more detail, but let's talk about, Jacqueline, let's talk about Singapore and geographically its place and in terms of a gateway to a much wider market. Where do you see its future? I mean, because it obviously is a developing country, but one that is very developed as well. I mean, where would you like to see its future?
Well, Singapore is rather blessed to be sitting in the midst of a very high-growth region, Asia, but also one that is home to a lot of potential nature-based solutions, and one that is actually ripe for advancement in terms of taking sustainability more seriously in its corporates and its governance. So Singapore can do a number of things. One relates to the green finance that Simon was talking about. Singapore is an international financial hub, and over 1/3 of the sustainability-related loans actually in the whole of the Asia-Pacific come through Singapore at the moment. We are very dedicated to green finance, and the Monetary Authority in Singapore has created a Green Finance Action Plan to back that, together with plans for monitoring and verification of carbon credits, and also a really good look at how sustainability commitments should be reported, monitored, and disclosed in financial statements. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we also want to be a hub for carbon services. Carbon services are absolutely critical in order to help other corporates meet their obligations or meet their ambitions. We already have over 70 carbon services firms in Singapore. In the next 3 to 5 years, we are hoping to grow that number to over 100 carbon services firms. And this includes the marquee leading name consultancies such as McKinsey and BCG and Bain, as well as PwC, who have all set up sustainability centers of excellence in Singapore. And it also includes some very niche and specialized consultancies and international organizations like South Pole and Conservation International. So it's very important to have that carbon services ecosystem. Final thing that it's very helpful for Singapore to build on behalf of our Asian neighbors, as well as the companies that are already headquartered in Singapore, is a carbon marketplace that is transparent, that it is trusted, and where you know that carbon credits are not going to be double counted and that they are high quality. So we've done a number of things, again, in partnership with the World Bank and the IATA for emissions trading, to set up an international climate warehouse initiative, which will be based in Singapore to help develop some of those carbon markets. Within Singapore, we also have CIX, which is a climate exchange, which actually puts together the trading of these credits in what we hope to be a liquid and sustainable manner with a lot of transparency and trust involved.
Sounds like you've got your inbox is full. Sounds you've got a very busy time ahead. And Simon, to you in closing, I'm sure you agree with a lot of that. And where is Standard Chartered's role as well within that?
So we've said that we want to mobilize $300 billion of capital into sustainable finance. I think our role is to support the work that people like Jacqueline and the EDB are doing and other governments around our footprint. When you look at where we are, back to that India example, the need is in our footprint. So our role is really to be that conduit and to help stimulate those investment flows. We've got a great investor client base in the West. We've got a real need in the East. Our job is to bring the two together.
So when we have a conversation again in Davos, not this time next year, maybe in 9 months' time, where do you
colder.
It'll be colder, which is not a bad thing, because I am so hot on this stage. But where do you think you'll be on that journey?
Look,
I mean, 9 months is not a long time, is it? Let me look at 10 years, 20 years. You tell me the time frame you'd like.
I think the curve is exponential. So I think it's hard enough to predict 1 year out, because I think the growth is so rapid. And you look at Davos today, the interest in this space is immense from people and businesses and markets that you really wouldn't expect that of. So I'm very, very optimistic. There is a framework that needs to be put in place. There needs to be consistency and transparency, but that will happen.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Thank you, Simon Cooper and Jacqueline Poh. A big round of applause, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.